Before we can talk about how anthropology disproves Noah's flood, I'm going to have to explain a few things about human evolution that you likely wouldn't know unless this is a subject that you're passionate about. These are concepts that are commonly misunderstood, but which you need to understand before I can make my point, or the next video in this series won't make sense to you either. Recently, there were a couple sensational news articles claiming to rewrite the story of human evolution. And one of them has a 7-million-year-old fossil hominid unearthed in Greece, and the headline says this means that humans came from Europe rather than Africa. But there's a couple of problems with that. One is that every time the news mentions any new fossil find, they always say that it's going to rewrite the theory of evolution, as if we'd all gotten it wrong until now. It doesn't seem to matter that whatever they've just discovered usually matches up with everything we already knew. Now, we knew there were at least 50 fossil ape species then that we don't have left today, and we already knew that some of them lived in southern Europe, so this isn't really news. It certainly doesn't mean that humans originated in Europe. And they're not even sure if what they found is even a hominin, and regardless, it's much too old to be directly associated with human ancestry. The various species of humans within the genus Homo evidently evolved from Australopiths. Our closest known ancestral archetype is Australopithecus afarensis, also known as Lucy, although she was just the first of hundreds of her species to be discovered. So when I say Lucy, I'm referring to the whole species and not any one individual. The media did the same thing with Ardipithecus. Artie was older than Lucy, so headlines proclaimed that Lucy wasn't our ancestor anymore because journalists don't understand paleoanthropology, and sensationalism is what sells the news. So let me set this straight. Lucy is roughly 3.2 million years old. Artie is more than 1 million years older than Lucy, and this new one from Greece is millions of years older than Artie. Artie's descendants may have led to multiple branches, only one of which include Lucy. Lucy's lineage led to multiple branches, only one of which include humans. Gracopithecus may have been one side branch that was probably not ancestral to either Artie or Lucy or anything else in the human evolutionary line. Maybe they're thinking that evolution is a linear progression rather than flowering lines of descent, each with their own branches, which may lead in different directions. Or maybe someone with that image in mind has also heard of the human migration out of Africa, and maybe they think that that momentous occasion only happened once, but it happened a few times, just with humans, and a few more times for each of our ancestors. And before we get into those ancestors, you need to understand how new species evolve. It's not that there was ever a first human baby born to a bunch of apes. Instead, it would be a gradual emergence of one group who are initially virtually indistinguishable from all those around them. It's when indicative traits spread through and change the whole population over time, just like the way languages evolve. There was never a first guy to speak French, Spanish, or Italian arising out of a population of Latin-speaking people. Instead, if you find some intermediate literature, like the original Don Quixote, you'll notice that it's not quite Spanish, but it's not just Latin anymore. It's transitional. The changes are so subtle over whole populations, over many generations, that you have to go away for a while and come back to notice that, hey, they're different now. So following this pattern, the earliest apes in the fossil record diverged from Old World monkeys in Africa, and both have since spread throughout the tropics, as well as into the temperate regions of Asia and Europe roughly 12 million years ago. Then we move to hominins like Ardipithecus and Australopithecus. If Gracopithecus is in that group, it would be the first basal hominin found outside Africa. And then we get to the genus Homo, which is more than just sapiens. There were a handful of different species or subspecies, and they too spread out of Africa, again, in multiple ways. Homo erectus, for example, spread all over Asia and Europe as well as Africa, where they evidently first appeared. And although they're considered to be a single species, Homo erectus is much more diverse than modern humans. I mean, think about the way that evolution works. It is never one thing turning into another completely different thing, like the creationists always pretend that it is. If it was that, how would you even know if anything was related? Instead, evolution is a matter of incremental, superficial changes being slowly compiled atop successive tiers of fundamental similarities. And changes in the core structure or reproductive process is very rare, so closely related organisms will usually differ only in surface features, and the more distantly related two organisms are, the deeper you'll have to look to find those similarities. And that's why the skeleton of any colubrid snake will be virtually indistinguishable from that of any other colubrid, no matter how different they actually are in life. Likewise, the skulls of different ethnicities within modern humans are indistinguishable to the untrained eye and give no hint to some of the physical or cultural differences they may have expressed. So if we found Homo erectus skulls in Europe, Africa, and Indonesia, we could assume that even if the skulls were identical, they were at least as different from each other as people are today. Especially because those tribes were completely separated culturally and genetically, not just by impassable barriers of geography, but also over a vast expanse of time. Because remember that the entirety of recorded human history spans only a few thousand years, but the fossil record of Homo erectus spans a couple million years. Separated tribes will build up a lot of unique distinctions over such a long period. And I'm not just talking about color either, but I do need to explain that if a colony lives in the tropics for several generations where the sun is directly overhead, the babies are going to be born darker and darker over time. If they move to temperate zones for several generations where the sun is at a lower and less intense angle, they'll be born lighter. It's a balance of receiving enough vitamin D through the sunlight without receiving too much ultraviolet radiation. That's all that is. So the differences between modern humans is literally only skin deep. But Homo erectus was so different from us and from each other that comparing their skulls was like comparing the skulls of different breeds of dogs. The line between species and subspecies is difficult to draw when you only have fossil evidence. If we didn't have any living dogs, paleontologists would doubtless have classified all these as different species. So it's funny that creationists will accept that all those skulls are different breeds of the same kind, but they insist that these skulls are from completely different kinds unrelated to each other. They just don't want to admit the obvious. And we found hundreds of Neanderthals and other distinguishable human groups who were all noticeably similar to each other, but Homo erectus varied remarkably, both in their assorted sizes and the range of sizes of their brains. And if they were that different on the inside, then how would Java man compare to Dimanasi, for example, on the outside? How did their behaviors or habits differ from each other? There's no way to know without a time machine. Isn't that a shame? You may have seen another sensational news story talking about 315,000-year-old anatomically modern Homo sapien fossils recently discovered in Morocco. Why is this significant? Well, it's 100,000 years older than we thought that they would be, but also understand that modern man, Neanderthals, and Denisovans are all descended from an earlier species, Homo heidelbergensis, which also originated in Africa, itself a descendant of Homo erectus. Then they spread across Africa, and some of them made it out into the Middle East, where Neanderthals and Denisovans were born, so to speak. They're the only two human groups that apparently originated outside of Africa. Then they diverged and went their separate ways. And sometime after that, we emerged from heidelbergensis tribes that were still in Africa. We share a common ancestor. Sapiens, Neanderthals, and Denisovans are like brothers of the same father. Neanderthals are like our older brothers, a couple 100,000 years older. They were tougher and stronger than us and even had bigger brains than most of us, yet they didn't make it, possibly because they had more hindbrain than forebrain. So they apparently didn't think like us. There's only a small trace of Neanderthal DNA in each of the ethnicities that passed through the Middle East in early migrations out of Africa, but none at all in groups that never left Africa. And Denisovans, on the other hand, appear to have blended with and dissolved into emerging waves of modern humanity. And the DNA of island peoples of Melanesia shows evidence of a fourth genetically distinct subspecies that we haven't found fossils for yet. Understand that if creationists were correct, then none of these fossils should exist. None of these early developing people should exist. The science-denying extreme believers try to dismiss Australopiths as merely apes, but they have no excuse for Homo erectus, because that is the ape man that they say cannot exist, and yet we found hundreds of them, widely dispersed on 3 continents. And this makes Homo erectus the granddaddy of all modern people, except that there is another distinctly different species of human that did not descend from Homo erectus. This is one of those rare occasions where the news story really was sensational even before the headline spiced it up. These so-called hobbits of Flores Island, Homo floresiensis, were a race of tiny people, only about a meter tall. and the remains at one burial site were dated at 17,000 years old. Although they had tiny brains, they also made stone tools and weapons. And while these hobbits were inarguably human in some respects, they retained traits that were only found in earlier African species like Homo rudolfensis and Australopithecus, traits which Homo erectus had lost. So the hobbits were as far removed from us as they can be and still be in the same genus. Whether you count them as human depends on what you think a human is. If it's just Homo sapiens and no other species, then hobbits are not human. I think any species in the genus Homo qualifies. Either way, here is another species whose ancestors came from the Dark Continent, and yet these hobbits are unknown outside Indonesia. So there must have been another migration of basal hominins perhaps 1 million years ago. Several successive waves of humans and humanoids, including some of the very first human species, Homo habilis or something like it, all found their ways out of Africa. And now let's talk about our own species alone. There's a difference between anatomically modern humans and Homo sapiens sapiens. The difference is subtle. They both look exactly the same. It's only a level of intellectual aptitude, of competence, cognizance, or comprehension. And it's still a subtle difference even then. Other Homo-sapiens were already making tools, inventing languages, and cooking with fire. Anthropologists determine higher order thinking through the complexity of the artifacts that were made or the presence of jewelry or other forms of art. These indications of advanced consideration only appeared in the last 90,000 years or so, and again, the oldest of these artifacts are always in Africa. Archaeology and paleontology can only tell us so much. Genetics can correct our impressions sometimes, but usually confirms what we already know and then fills in the rest of the story. This is important, and it relates to the next video too. Because our species has lived in Africa so much longer than anywhere else, there is more genetic variability there than anywhere else. As people migrate across the globe, they only take a fraction of that genetic variation with them. And everywhere they go, some people stay and colonize new communities, while the nomads among them move to new lands, creating a series of population bottlenecks, with each community flowering out of small connected populations. So we can trace these migrations in the genome of descendant colonies all along that route and everywhere else. Population geneticists have found hundreds of thousands of genetic markers with genotyping and sequencing techniques, comparing whole genomes from thousands of individuals in over 100 locations around the world. These show patterns of migration in the form of bottlenecks and genetic variation, resulting from small populations and isolation, as well as the subsequent appearance of unique genetic markers peculiar to each of these groups. They've also established a way to date these migrations, with significant mutations such as a genetic marker occurring in mitochondrial or Y chromosome DNA at an average of once every 60 generations or so. And what these combined international studies show is at least one significant exodus out of Africa, roughly 60,000 to 70,000 years ago, and 90% of everyone else, everywhere else, can trace their ancestry to that event. And we're not just talking about 8 people coming off Noah's Ark either. This was a mass exodus of thousands, leaving a continent that was already populated top to bottom. And while there is no evidence of a global flood, paleoclimatologists have found evidence around the world of shorelines fluctuating substantially as a series of ice ages advanced and receded. At times, the sea levels dropped so much that it joined many island chains into passable walkways, and archaeological evidence from these early human migrations have been confirmed in areas that were once inhabited or traversed, but are now underwater. There wasn't just one migration either. The people living in Papua New Guinea show 2% genetic traces from a smaller, earlier migration. And this is backed by the fact that 90,000-year-old stone spearheads in North Africa match some found in India from 78,000 years ago, an earlier migration. They didn't use carbon-14 to date that either. The spear points were buried in the eruption of the Toba supervolcano. So scientists used potassium argon to date the igneous rock and volcanic ash on top of them. 10% of Europeans can trace their genetics to one mitochondrial Eve, an earlier immigrant from roughly 40,000 years ago. And Native Americans can trace their ancestry to a Y chromosome Adam from 20,000 years ago who came from Asia. And so it goes for everyone in the world. And some Chinese scientists believe that their people had evolved directly from Homo erectus in Asia, independently of the rest of Homo sapiens emanating from Homo heidelbergensis in Africa. If true, this would have made Chinese a different subspecies and not Homo sapiens at all. They had a rich fossil history of Homo erectus and the type of stone tools that they thought could go along with this idea, but nothing conclusive. In seeking genetic proof, they singled out a male genetic marker that only appeared in African sapiens about 80,000 years ago. So any man who carries that marker must have recent African ancestors and can't be descended from the more recent Asian Homo erectus. They took DNA from over 160,000 ethnic groups around East Asia, over 12,000 samples.
We did not see even one single individual that could be considered as the descendant of the Homo erectus in China. Rather, everybody was a descendant of our ancestors from Africa.
Sorry, man. So everyone in China can now trace their ancestry back to Africa, just like everyone else, everywhere in the world. How does that match up with the story of Noah's Ark landing on Mount Ararat, which is in Turkey? Now consider this. The oldest complete skeleton ever found in Britain was from a man who died over 9,000 years ago in roughly 7150 BC, well before any date ever suggested for the flood. Now, if you're a creationist, then you'll likely ignore mitochondrial mutation rates, radiocarbon dating, and anything else that implies an age over 6,000 years or so, even when multiple dating methods match. But you should at least expect that if he lived in Britain, and he died in or before the flood, as he surely must have, then he couldn't possibly be Noah's ancestor, which means he couldn't have any living descendants. But if Noah's Ark is just a fable, and the evolutionary perspective on anthropology is reasonably accurate, then you'd expect that this guy could have living descendants, and if he does, they're probably English. But this could only be the case if there was never a global flood. So if you're a creationist, you'll be disappointed to hear that the DNA in his bones positively identified a direct genetic descendant living only a half a mile away. But if you're a creationist, then you'll ignore that too, so I'll give you a better one. All along the Pacific coast of the Americas, there are archaeological artifacts such as arrowheads, spearheads, wooden tools, campsites, and whole settlements with animal hides and discarded remains of nuts, berries, potato skins, and even human bones. With many of these items, radiocarbon dated from 13,000 to 14,000 years old. More important than that, scientists identified DNA in one of these ancient human bones found in southern Alaska, and it bore a rare genetic marker that only occurs in 2% of Native Americans today. Anthropologist John Johnson spent 15 years collecting DNA from modern Native Americans, and he found that rare genetic marker not only in the bones of the Ice Age, but recurring in a series of existing Native American communities all along the Pacific coast. Now, as a creationist, determined to dismiss or reject any and all evidence against your position, you would accept that people migrated along this coast if they were Noah's grandkids. And you'll make up whatever excuse necessary to dismiss all the cross-confirmed dating methods too, imagining that these people somehow spread out and populated the world at hyperspeed, with reproductive generations as fast as that of rabbits, such that a migration that really started with thousands of people and took tens of thousands of years could somehow be accomplished from only 8 people in only a century or so, because everywhere in the world was immediately inhabited right after the flood. Actually, it was already inhabited even during your flood. We know that none of that is possible, so the flood didn't happen. But you wouldn't accept that. And another thing that you cannot accept is this rare genetic marker, exclusive to Native Americans, proving that the people who were already there thousands of years before the flood are the direct ancestors of the people who are still living there now. They couldn't have all drowned thousands of years ago and then be replaced by Noah's kids with the exact same DNA. Therefore, there can't have been a global flood. All the evidence from every source aligns, whereas believing in creationism requires continuously making up excuses to try to explain away every indication of reality. Radiometric dating and luminescent dating of ancient footprints and archaeological artifacts, as well as human remains, all match mitochondrial dates. So the archaeological, climatological, paleontological, and molecular evidence all match. The only thing that doesn't match anything, and therefore doesn't work, is a contradictory compilation of man-made mythology from the Middle East.